Right. So today we're going to talk about how to write an introduction for research articles and doctoral dissertations. Right. So this course is supposed to be sort of mainly concerned about writing the thesis, but as I said earlier, when you do this degree, you should not just be concerned with writing a thesis. You also need to think about maybe how you can publish some research articles while you're doing the degree, because later on when you look for a job, when you face the selection panel, they will ask you, what are your publications, because that's the evidence of your potential as a researcher. Okay, so people want to hire people who have the potential to do more research. Of course, if you have a degree, if you have a PhD, then that would suggest that you have done some research, you have the abilities, but then research articles in good journals are also important. Yeah, I also believe that introduction is very difficult to write. One of the reasons is that in the introduction part, your main job is to persuade your readers that your work is actually worthy, is actually important, so that the editors and reviewers will say, okay, this is good paper, let's publish it. Okay? Because good journals, they can only publish a certain number of articles every year. So that's the kind of reality everyone has to live with. So there are so many manuscripts out there, most of them are good when it comes to a stage of peer review. So in order to stand out, you have to first convince your readers that actually the choice of your topics is very a good choice. So basically you have to, and in order to do that, you have to refer to all the other literature, all the other studies that have been done before you, and you have to pay them respect. You have to mention and discuss their contribution and value, but at the same time you have to be critical and to indicate there is some gap in the literature which you can fill with your study. So there are two goals that are kind of conflicting with one another. Right? You need to be positive, but at the same time you have to be critical. So that's another reason why it's so difficult to write a good introduction. And that's going to be what we want to talk about today. The overview, I'm going to introduce Carr's model. I think Carr's model is kind of the model that every teacher of advanced academic writing is going to talk about, because this is a classical model for writing introductions, and this is also one of the major contributions of John Swales, who is the founder of genre theory. And then I will try to demonstrate how to analyze an RA, research article introduction, and see to what extent Carr's model is actually applicable. And I would like to argue that Carr's model is only applicable to some extent when we really use this model to analyze the specific research article. And this is why when we try to adopt this model to write our own introduction, we have to be somewhat cautious and critical, because we have to adapt this model to fit our needs. And I will also try to review some of the literature on research article and thesis introductions. So if you really recall what we did last time, I reviewed some of the literature on abstract. Actually there are scholars who study abstracts to contribute to the literature of ESP and EAP. So we can also find articles that study introductions. So I will try to look at this literature and see whether or not we can get some insights from those literature. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the arrangement for next week, the second hour of week 4. You will need to write an introduction in class. Right? So these are the literature that I have sort of collected for, most of the literature is on RA introduction, as you can see, and then there are also a few on doctoral thesis introduction. If you go to this page here, and you can come to this page through this link here, which is bit.ly/MCCP intro. And from here, you can find a folder of ESP literature. So this is the link where you can get to a Google Drive folder. And I put together all these different research articles that are relevant to this course, because this course is about thesis and research article writing, and it's just so happened that there's a field of ESP and another field called EAP. There are scholars who studies the practice of academic writing. So we have a lot of literature actually that are sort of relevant to this course. I would encourage you to look into this literature. Of course, it's not your sort of area, so you don't necessarily have to read them very closely, but I think you can just skim them and at least look at the title and the abstract, and you have an idea, you know, what this literature is about. And I have to say, most of the studies are mainly written for professionals or experts within the field. So to what extent they are actually useful for outsiders, like people who actually have to write the articles, I'm not sure, but I think we need to make some efforts and try to translate all these research studies into something that is helpful and useful for teaching academic writing. So that's at least something we should try. So these are the literature available for you to consider. Right. And for today, I will try to maybe, you know, just to go over some of the studies which I find somewhat useful. So again, CARS model. I will start by introduce this CARS model. CARS stands for Create a Research Space, right? So that's the thing, that's the main job for us when we write the introduction, is to create a space so that we can fill in with our study, and that will be a paper to be published, or would be your thesis. And it's first proposed by Swales 1990. Unfortunately, I haven't found a PDF for Swales 1990. I think if I couldn't find it in a year or something, I would go ahead and scan it and make it available. So that's the starting point of genre theory and genre studies. And this model was proposed based on an analysis of 158 RA introductions in English across different disciplinary areas. So according to CARS model, there are 3 moves that we have to execute or make in order to write this instruction. The first one is establishing a territory, so it could be old to you if you studied this before. Just bear with me. And basically in this move, as the text says here, the author has to set the context of the research, providing a necessary background to tell the readers that this is the area, a specific area where the study will contribute to, okay? And within that move, there could be 3 steps. The first step is to claiming centrality, and that's probably one of the most important steps, is to convince the readers that this is actually an area that is worth or merits research attention, okay? Because again, the idea is that the space of the journals, especially good journal, is very limited, and you have to make sure that your contribution is valuable. So how do you do that? The first thing is to make sure that the topic that you focus on is actually a lively, significant, and well-established research area. Okay, so that's the first step, is to claiming centrality. And the second step is to make topic generalization, which is basically make a statement about the topic. But in a way, I think in reality, sometimes 2 steps can be executed at the same time with just 1 sentence. Because imagine you can write 1 sentence to make a general claim about a topic, which is making topic generalization, but at the same time, you can also claim that this is a very important topic. Okay, so it's quite, you know, feasible to combine these 2 steps, and that happens all the time. All right. And one thing that's also important is if you look at a lot of research articles, usually the writers will start with something relatively broad, okay? But then the focus will have to be narrowed to something more specific, and then that would be the focus of the present study. Okay, so that's another important strategy when you actually write introduction. So step 2 is to make topic generalization. And step 3 is to review previous items of research. And one thing you have to keep in mind is that for a lot of research articles, and definitely for your doctoral or MPhil thesis, there will be a section or even a chapter for literature review. So in other words, there should be a more extensive literature review in the later part of the paper or your thesis. So at this stage, when you review the literature, it's going to be quite brief. And sometimes we call this name dropping. So when I say name dropping, I mean that you have one sentence, and after that sentence you have a bracket, and in the bracket you can have multiple authors. It could be up to 7 studies that you will cite just to support that one sentence. I think this kind of name dropping is quite useful because in a sense it's to demonstrate to the readers that you are aware of this body of literature which is relevant, which sort of shows that this is a very lively and important topic, and at the same time sort of referring to these authors is also has some practical importance, because it could happen that one of the reviewers is one of the authors that you cite here, and citing other people, other scholars' work is an act of courtesy that we need to learn to do, in order to survive and thrive in this community. All right, so I think at this stage you don't have to do anything extensive. You just have to drop a few names and mention some of the literature. That's all you have to do. But when you review the literature, you may also want to talk about what other scholars have to say. That would be the claims made by the author, so that in the next step, and one of the steps for move 2, establishing the niche, you can do something called counterclaiming, which means you are actually respond to a claim made by other scholars in the earlier studies, and somehow you're trying to challenge that position, and this is where you can start introducing your own study. So in a way, your study has to be somewhat different from the earlier studies. Could be, maybe you hold a different position or different perspectives. Okay, usually you don't necessarily will disagree with the earlier scholars in a substantial way. It's more likely that you're going to try to look at this problem from a different perspective, and you argue that your perspective is actually a new one that other people have overlooked. That would be a good way to establish a niche. Just remind you what is a niche. If you look at the dictionary, the most relevant definition for niche is a specialized segment of the market for a particular kind of product or service. And obviously, this definition is provided in the context of business or marketing. Okay, but in our context, niche means that you need to find a topic or specific issue which you are particularly good at. You have the kind of skills and ability that you can contribute to the literature. Okay, so in a way, the niche in the academic research is similar to the niche in marketing, in that you need to specialize, you need to have your own strength in order to contribute something. Okay, so one of the steps that you can take for move 2 is to establish a niche. And indicating a gap would be the next step. So after you make your counterclaim, you want to argue that actually there's a gap in the literature, which means there's something that other people have overlooked, or there's something that maybe a problem that was not fully solved. And the gap would be where you can contribute your study, contribute to the literature. Okay, and at the same time, you can also try to raise some questions, okay, the questions about previous research, which would suggest further research has to be done. And that further study would be the study that you're going to write about in the article. And another step that's well suggested here is to continuing a tradition. In other words, whatever study you do, it has to be somewhat an extension of the existing research. So that's another reason why it's very important for us to be familiar with a body of literature because you have to somehow build your own study out of the tradition of the existing literature, right? So that's the second move, establishing the niche. Then we move on to the third move, which is to occupy the niche. So once you identify this is the area where you want to contribute, then you can try to turn this niche into research space. That's what course model is about. So specific step for this move, including outlining the purpose. So you want to tell the readers, what is your main purpose or goal or objective of the study, and sometimes you may also state your research questions. So research questions would be something that you need to formulate in order to guide your studies. I think this is a common practice in humanity and social science, maybe not for engineering and natural sciences. So again, that's something you want to consider. Announcing the present research, again, it's a very succinct, very short summary of what this study is about. And perhaps you also want to announce principal findings, but here in practice, it's not always possible or feasible to talk too much about the main findings, because for one thing, without talking about the method and result, it will be very difficult for the readers to understand your finding anyway. So in a way, maybe one thing you could do, instead of talking about the specific findings of your study, you can just talk a little bit about the major contribution of your studies, in what way your study can shed new light on certain issues, or maybe make contribution to certain areas of the theories, instead of going into the details of the finding. So that would be another possibility for this step. And then for some areas, it again depends on your field. I think it's more likely in the natural science and engineering that the author would also do a little bit like signposting to tell the readers, okay, the rest of the paper would be organized as follows: section 2, section 3, and we concluded article in section 4 or something like that. But again, it's very discipline specific. You have to look at what other people in your field are doing to decide whether this particular step should be adopted. All right, so that's course model. And then I will try to use this course model to analyze a research article introduction. So perhaps you can go back to this document here. I actually try to analyze this research article. This is my own paper, so it's like after publishing this paper, I can go back to the text and try to figure out whether or not I have adopted course model. All right, so if you look at the first sentence here, basically we're trying to look at, one of the challenge is that, EAL scholars are under enormous pressure to have their research article published. So in a way, I think this is more like a topic generalization, because we're trying to make a statement about the field, which is kind of like a well-known fact. But that's the starting point, because in this statement, we also try to look at a problem. This is a large problem, a big problem facing the research community. So can we say it's claiming centrality? In a way it is, because it's a serious problem facing the community. That's why this is research that merits attention. This is a problem that merits attention. This is research that should be published, I guess. So that's claiming the centrality. But then the next question is, in a way, we try to narrow the focus, because now we look at the doctoral students. Because the previous sentence we look at an EAL scholars, so that's a larger group, but doctoral students is a more specific group. So in a sense, I would say this sentence just to narrow the focus. right? And also the focus is more relevant here because most of the data that we use for this article is from helping the doctoral students publishing their papers. Okay, so in a sense, when we narrow the focus, we make the discussion a little bit closer or more relevant to the present study. And then the next sentence here is, again, shifting the focus a little bit. Now we are not talking about the pressure that EAL scholars have to face to publish their papers in English journals. Instead, we're looking at the difficulties that they have to overcome. So I would say this is, again, another topic generalization, which is to highlight some of the difficulties with publishings. And after that, we try to elaborate the point with more specific examples. All right. And followed by that would be further elaboration with a new concept. And the concept here is authorial persistence. All right. And then we move on to the next paragraph. We see that here, we look at, the contributions of EAL scholars are important. So that's another topic generalization. We're making another general statement that most people in the field will agree, which is, the contribution of EAL scholars is important. That's another point to make to justify the study. All right. So I think at this point, the main job or the main concern is to convince the readers that this is an important area that we can further conduct research. And after that is more elaboration with examples, reviewing more literature. So given this difficulty with publishing, there are some existing solutions with the problem. So the existing solutions for the problem would include things like developing a mentoring program, or there are some workshops that and courses that can be made available for the ELL authors, and also the editorial services. So in a way, this paragraph is all about existing solutions to the problems. And then after talking about the existing solutions, we can move on to talk about, the solution that we want to explore. Okay, so move on to the next paragraph here. You can see this is a very important technique for making transition from one paragraph to another. So how do you make transition from one paragraph to another? One important strategy is that before you move on to talk about the main idea or point in the present paragraph, you want to refer back to some of the points made in the earlier paragraph. So that's why here, for most EAL scholars who lacks access to such programs or cannot afford the editing services, so such programs would be the programs that we talked about earlier here, like mentoring program or workshops, and the editing services would be the editorial services that we mentioned earlier. So this is how we make transition from one paragraph to another, is to referring to a point made earlier. Okay. So then we can see here, this is another topic generalization. This is going to be closer to the present study. Again, we're talking about literacy broker. Okay. And after that, there is some categorization of the shapers, which is a follow-up with the previous sentence, again, to review the literature. I think in a sense we're trying to make a counterclaim, maybe, and then we try to even narrow the focus further when we say, the Yale scholars is trying to get some help from native speakers, and also some other people who try to help them as convenience editors. So that would be the English teachers on campus, right? Language teachers. Okay, so that's actually the case study that we look at, which is a language teacher in a university in China, helping the researchers to publish the papers. All right, so and then we can see here is where we indicate a gap. Okay, despite the research attention paid to the shapers and literacy brokers, little is known about the actual editing or revision changes that are made to help Yale's scholar achieve the publications. Okay, so this is sort of one of the steps in the course model as well, is to indicate a gap, and then you can try to occupy the niche. But then after you indicate the gap, ideally you also want to refer to the literature in order to further strengthen the argument that this is a gap that we should try to fill. So we have this another study, another article. This author has referred to editors who do such work as being able to give insightful from the cold-face perspective on the handling of NNS text, and has called for more research attention to be paid to these intuitive and experienced language experts, as such people could contribute to training people for this emerging profession. This study is actually one of the most important study for my paper, because when I try to cook or develop this idea to do this study, I think I can still remember, this line that I read, when I read this article, and when I see this word from the cold face, I got the idea. So I realized, okay, this is my opportunity to contribute to the literature, because I have done a lot of editing work with different people, and I've got data, but then where can I find the gap to contribute to literature? And when I look at this line, I figure that that's my opportunity. Okay, so I think this is something you might want to consider as well. When you read the literature, it's not just about getting the idea or getting the message, information from the author. What you need to do is to look through the literature, and somehow at some point you will be able to see, okay, this is a gap that I'm going to fill with my study. So if you have that moment, then that's the starting point for eventually get a paper published, right? So that's why you still have to do a lot of reading, and when you read, hopefully you will have that moment, okay? That's my contribution, okay? So again, review the literature to justify the present study. That's what I did, and the present study seeks to occupy this research gap. So I'm being quite explicit here. Occupy the gap. That's what Swells told us to do. Okay. So basically, this is where we announce the present study with the purpose and the data. And another thing, when we write this paper, I was talking with my supervisor. I said one of the major concerns that the reviewer might raise is that this is a single case study, because all the data comes from the process of me helping the students. Okay, so there's only one editor involved. So if the reviewer or the editor challenge this, there's really nothing we can do. So in order to sort of be proactive and try to sort of deal with this potential fatal challenge, we actually put a lot of words in the paper to justify this case study, and also to acknowledge this weakness in the study. So when we get the reviewers' comments back, we look through the reviewers' comments. There's no criticism about the fact that this is a single study. Then I feel really relieved, because otherwise, that's basically the death penalty for my paper. Okay? So that's another thing you want to think about is you cannot write a perfect paper, right? There are always some kind of weaknesses here and there. But there are something that you can try to improve and fix. That there are also some other issues that's just not possible for you to deal with. Then what you can do is try to put that in your discussion section up front so that the reviewer won't have to criticize that. So that's another strategy for you to consider. Okay, so in a way, we try to analyze this article. I try to demonstrate, how we can try to assign different moves and steps to an research article introduction, adopting the course model. So it's up to you. I think you can decide, after looking at the analysis here, to what extent the course model is actually applicable to the this particular article or introduction. So I would say it really depends on the individual article. When authors write a paper, they don't always have course model next to them. We write papers in a way that we feel that is the best way to introduce the topic, and course model would be something maybe we can think about later. So that means people don't always follow this convention, and there could be all kind of variation and changes. So I wouldn't say you have to always follow this any model when you write a paper, but in case you need help, in case you feel it's difficult to get started with writing this introduction, maybe you should try to at least look at the model and see whether you can get some help from it. And another possibility is you should try to analyze a number of research articles in your field and see whether or not there might be some patterns, again, that you can borrow to write your own paper. Okay, so you don't necessarily have to use the course model, but instead you can try to apply this genre study, genre analysis techniques, and to find your own model that would fit your needs. Okay. So that's the sort of the demonstration for analyzing the introduction, and hopefully you will be able to analyze your own text to decide how to write a paper. And very quickly, I'm going to also introduce some of the studies on introduction. One of them, this is quite early actually, from Lawrence Anthony. And actually, Lawrence Anthony is the professor who developed the NCONC, which is a very useful corpus tool. But at the early stage of his career, he also published something on genre studies. So basically, Professor Anthony analyzed 12 research articles in software engineering to try to validate the course model, because course model has been around for almost a decade now. So he's trying to see whether or not research articles in software engineering would follow course model. So he assigned moves and steps in course model to the sentences in his corpus, and then try to also interview the specialists to seek some insight or comments on these moves. I think this is a very important methodological point. When people in ESP trying to look at a corpus and trying to analyze the data, we have to be careful with the problem that we don't really understand the material very well. Because all these materials are on the completely different discipline or subjects. And one way to remedy this problem is to try to interview the specialist, and hopefully we can gain some insight from the interview. So somehow, based on Anthony's study, he actually proposed a modified course model based on the analysis here. So you can see there is some of the new steps that he proposed, but the overall structure, the 3 moves, are more or less the same. Okay. And there's another study. This one is from Harano 2009, and you can see that this author is also trying to use a course model to analyze research article introductions, but this time there's the comparison between Brazilian, Portuguese, and English data, right? And you can see that actually one of the interesting results is that all the ESP paper, all the English papers pretty much follow the course model 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. It's still course model. But if you look at the Brazilian Portuguese data, you can see that quite a few research article introduction actually there's no move to. Okay. Some of the studies, move to is skipped. So what is move to? So the steps in move to, if you look at that, is counterclaiming, indicating a gap, and question raising. So in a way, move to is the most critical move, in the sense that when I say critical, I'm not saying it's important, but that the fact that you have to be critical in order to execute this move. You have to sort of do the counterclaim, which means you have to criticize an earlier scholar's work. And when you indicate a gap, in a sense, you have to say, okay, other people have overlooked this, and this is my contribution. But because Brazil, like mainland China, is an authoritarian society, so maybe there's a possibility that there's a lack of critical thinking, or not necessarily that the scholars there cannot think critically, but maybe the culture is not always sort of conducive or accommodating to this kind of practice. Actually, the author talked about this in his or her paper as well. So if you're interested, you can take a look. And that could be an issue for us to think about as well. As a researcher, how are you going to deal with earlier scholars' work? As I said earlier, you have to be positive, but at the same time, you have to be critical. Wang and Yang, 2015. This one is actually quite interesting because this paper focusing on claiming centrality as promotion. So that's a particular step in course model, which is you are trying to convince the readers that this is a very important contribution of the paper. So the specific research questions that the author trying to address include what types of appeals do applied linguists usually make, and how are these types of appeals realized linguistically, and how frequently do they make the appeals? Okay. And one interesting finding from this study is that there are actually 4 different types of appeals: appeal to salience, appeal to magnitude, appeal to topicality, and appeal to problematicity. Right, I'm not going to get into the details, but just want to show you that this is one study which tells us, there are different possibilities in terms of making the appeal to convince the readers that, your research is valuable. I would say these are the findings that are very relevant to people who are doing applied linguistics or maybe social science studies, but not necessarily for natural science and engineering. Yeah, this is one of the quantitative result. All structural 7 is looking at variability within a single discipline. Because this is about applied linguistics again, we have 2 fields, second language writing and second language acquisition. Maybe it's not that relevant to most of you, so we just very quickly go over this. They have some findings in terms of the move structure from second language acquisition corpus, from second language writing corpus, and the author is trying to explain these differences with some theories or explanations. Okay, so these are something maybe you can, if you're interested or relevant, you find it relevant, you can look at it later. SEMRA 202, this one is research articles, introductions, variation across disciplines. So the author actually look at 2 disciplines and then try to investigate the disciplinary variation. By the time you're looking at more of these papers, you find that actually it's getting a bit boring. They always cite swells, look at the Cars model, blah blah blah. But I always wonder, how useful these papers are, other than getting something published and get promoted. But then Bunton 201 is a different one because this is actually a book chapter, and this scholar actually looked at the PhD thesis. So in a way, it's probably more relevant to us. And actually, the author looked at 45 PhD thesis introductions from the University of Hong Kong. And one thing that he noticed is that in fields like medicine, social sciences, and arts, the introduction chapter is much longer. It's 26 to 34 pages, and then science, engineering, education is only 9 to 10 pages. Okay, so how long do you need to write for your introduction chapter? That will be something you have to consult your supervisors. Also, you can ask around, and something you have to decide. And then 12 out of 45 introductions are not divided into sections. That means the majority of them are divided into sections. So actually, one finding from the chapter is to look at how these headings are arranged, and they find that the author find that actually most of the section headings are generic in the sense that there's no specific sort of contents related to the study in the heading. Okay, so the two overall focuses on the generic heading would be introduce the field and introducing the present study. There are also some newly identified steps that the author found from analyzing the data that is not listed in the course model. So again, that would be something for you to consider when you look at the theses or research articles in your field. It's very likely you will be able to identify some of the steps that are not part of the course model. So you have to modify the model when you write the paper. Yeah, that's pretty much what I have to say today. Let me just tell you a little bit about the in-class exercise for writing an introduction. This is going to be something you need to do in class, which is next week, the second hour. So next week, from 3:30 p.m. to 4:20 p.m., you have to be here, because if you skip that hour, then you won't be able to get points for this assignment. I don't really want to do another makeup session for you, so please do come, all right? Showing up is very important because this course is pass or fail. So even if you don't do very well in the assignment, I don't think you're going to fail the course, right? But if you don't show up, then you will miss 20% of the grade. Then it is possible for you to fail the course, actually. All right, so anyway, this is an introduction you need to write, and you have to write it independently, which means even when you write on a computer, I trust that you're not going to consult any sources or use any tools, all right? Because this is a diagnostic exercise. In other words, we try to use this exercise to identify some of the problems or weaknesses you might have with writing. Okay, as I said earlier, this is a low-stake course. It's a pass or fail course, and most likely you're going to pass. So I don't see any reason why you want to sort of consult the sources and try to do better than you can actually do independently, right? So that's something you want to keep in mind. And then I hope you can think about your rhetorical purposes. Each of the sentence that you write, you need to think about what is the purpose, what is the movement steps that you're trying to execute here, and hopefully you can try to adapt and adopt the course model. Right? So that would be something for you to consider.